And welcome you to this second in the Kendal College series on climate change. Our speaker today is Humston, an expert on marine biology and the ecology of fisheries. His topic of the lecture today is the ecological impacts of climate change. Robert did his undergraduate work at Bowdoin College, majoring in biology and English. He later received a PhD degree from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. He's currently a professor of biology at Washington and Lee, where he's taught since 2008. He's also the director of the university's Environmental Studies program. Robert studies fish populations with an emphasis on recreational fisheries. His current research, by the way, for those of you who are fisher people, my son-in-law told me anglers, focuses on smallmouth bass in the James River, so nearby. Last week, those of you, I see most of you were here, Lisa Greer explained the phenomena of greenhouse gases, the carbon cycle, and climatic impacts of increased atmospheric and land temperatures around the globe. Robert's going to pick up on that theme and take us the next step along the way and talk to us about the human and ecological impacts of climate change. So without further ado, I hope you'll give a very warm Kendal College welcome to Robert Humston.
I'm just going to try to modulate my voice there because I'm afraid I'm going to blow these speakers out. Last week you got to hear from my wife, Lisa Greer. I understand she did a great job. She's a tough act to follow, but I've dealt with that for the last 22 years, so I'm used to it. I followed her here, and I followed her here, so that's fine. This is actually a series of lectures that we first designed for our Intro to Environmental Studies classes at the university, and the idea was to overview the science underlying climate change, the ecological impacts to the Earth that climate change will have, and then in the more social science-focused lecture that I believe Jim Casey is going to give, there's a lot more emphasis on how those changes will affect human civilizations. So today, my goal is to talk about how climate affects ecology first, and then about how ecology affects humans. Because I find that if we just talk about how climate affects ecology, it's hard to engage with it sometimes because we don't necessarily have a place of reference with the kinds of changes we talk about. So I put this polar bear up here for a reason, and I'm sure some of you groaned as soon as you saw it because it's been the face of climate change for too long now. But there's a reason for it, and it's a little bit of a cheap shot. I put a bear cub up there, right? So I'm trying to tug at your heartstrings right away. But that's not my goal. The reason I put the polar bear first is because it's an example of exactly the types of changes that we anticipated. We've known about climate change now since the 1970s, and in the 1990s, ecologists really started to pay attention to what early signs we were seeing of ecological impacts and what expectations we could have. And the polar bear was one of those easy guesses, so to speak. So y'all, I'm sure, are aware that in average climate, average temperature changes latitudinally, and the coldest temperatures in the Arctic region where polar bears reside are part of their habitat. As climate changes, basically what happens is the average temperatures sort of move northward, right? So you get warmer temperatures at higher latitudes, right? And one of the things we expect is that as that happens, we're going to see shifts in the populations of different species to sort of follow those changing temperatures. We're already seeing this in action. So if you've ever had a garden or worked a farm, you're probably familiar with the USDA's plant hardiness zones, which these are zones the USDA defines for planting and growing different species of crops or of ornamentals, of trees and things like that. And we use this information to guide us for everything from when to plant certain crops. So people around here that are getting ready to plant winter wheat, they'll use the USDA's guidelines for planting no later than November, based on the plant hardiness zone. But if they were further south, they might be able to get away with planting it a little bit later. What we've seen since the 1990s is that these zones, which are basically based on temperature, are moving northward. So you can see the warmest zone we have here, this orange zone, was basically relegated, if we just look at Texas, to the southern half of Texas. But the USDA had to redraw these maps in 2015, and now it reaches up as high as Oklahoma. So basically what's happening is we're seeing this sort of northward shift in average temperatures, with higher latitudes becoming warmer. So let's get back to the polar bear then. One thing that we expected to happen, and we're seeing, is that we expected that the northern hemisphere and the Arctic temperatures in particular would change faster than the southern hemisphere and the Antarctic temperatures. We knew that based on the kind of evidence that Lisa presented before and where the patterns of glaciation happened over the area of the Earth. We know that it was very dramatic as climate changed in the northern hemisphere and not as dramatic in the southern hemisphere. So what we're seeing in the last 50 years, redder basically means more change in temperature, a more dramatic change in temperature, is that the Arctic areas are changing at a more rapid pace. They're getting warmer faster than the rest of the Earth. Again, that's what we expected. So how does that affect polar bears? Well, polar bears, if you will, they live at the top of the biggest mountain, right? They live at the top of the world. This is, we're looking now here at the Earth from the very top. So right in the center is the North Pole. Surrounding that is the Arctic Ocean. And then you've got the United States with Alaska here, all areas of Canada, Greenland, and on into Russia, Finland, etc. Okay? The blue area that I've outlined is, based on our best scientific evidence, the current range of polar bears, their distribution across the Arctic, right? And this is primarily driven by one particular type of habitat, and that is sea ice. So polar bears are dependent on sea ice as habitat. They use it to hunt seals. It's a platform for hunting, for caring for the cubs, etc. And as you can see, this is the sort of maximum extent of sea ice here. All the white area that you see is sea ice in the oceans. And you can see as it extends here into Baffin Bay and Hudson Bay areas, then so does the polar bear's range. In areas where it doesn't extend into, the polar bear doesn't appear. Right? So the polar bear's range is determined by the extent of sea ice. And sea ice has been getting smaller and smaller every year. And so these are observations on the maximum sea ice extent, the furthest total area that it reached in millions of kilometers, square kilometers. So 8 million square kilometers at the top, 3 million square kilometers at the bottom. As you can see, between 1980 and 2015, sea ice is only about half of what it used to be. It's declining at a very steady pace. And this is just simply because the nights don't get as cold in the Arctic as they used to, and the days are a little bit warmer than they used to be as well. And so the ice just can't form. And that's basically reducing the overall range for polar bears. It's reduced the total habitat that they have to inhabit. It has not yet really started to reduce the polar bear populations because the polar bears are trying to adapt. Polar bears are a long-lived, very slow reproducing species. And species like that don't respond quickly to environmental change. It's more of a sort of slow response, right? And so what we're seeing is that as polar bears are getting more crowded into less area, they're starting to wander into habitats that they historically didn't inhabit, and they're seeking basically new alternatives for food in response to more competition for resources. Through time, what that's going to lead to is every polar bear gets a smaller slice of the pie, which will lead to lower reproductive rates, higher mortality, and a slow but sure, steady reduction in their population. If the sea ice extent is small enough and competition among polar bears is great enough, we may see total extinction of the species on the planet. It's projected that by about the year 2050, there'll be these are some projections now, these are not necessarily agreed upon by all scientists, but there'll be about half the number of polar bears on Earth by about 2050, and there are some projections that say by 2100 there'll be none. So this is not to try to sound an alarm or anything like that. This is just a perfect example of exactly the type of things that we would expect. So because these things live at the top of the world, and as the average temperature is increasing with latitude northward, they have nowhere to go. Much like a species that lives high up on a mountain, as the mountain gets warmer, they have to go higher to seek colder temperatures and higher elevations, and eventually they run out of mountain. And what's going to happen here is the polar bears will run out of cold, so to speak. So the reason I like this as an example, even though it is, again, a little bit of a cheap shot, is that it exemplifies what I try to teach my students about climate change and ecology. And this is where I start with this explanation with them. I don't start with the polar bear. I start with this. Ecology is a young science. When it was first proposed in the late 1800s, everybody looked at it as the interaction between an organism and its environment. Everything from how a living organism responded to the type of habitat you put it in, to how it might even change its habitat by living there, right? That interaction all the time. And then in the 1960s, an Australian named Andrew Wartha suggested really what it boils down to is the distribution and abundance of all life on Earth. So if we think about where we see certain forms of life, it's determined by how they interact with the habitat and with the environment there. If it's too hot for them to live there, their numbers won't be very high, or they'll be absent entirely. And if their temperature or their climate is perfect, and there's plenty of resources for food, and they're not being constantly picked off by predators, then their populations will grow, and they'll establish a presence there. And so when we look at how the interaction between organisms and their environment plays out, ultimately it determines where we see certain things and where we don't see certain things, right? So if we think of ecology as simply the distribution and abundance of organisms, one of the things that determines, well, two of the things, that determine abundance and distribution most strongly are temperature and water. If we think about the sort of most extreme habitats, the oceans and the deserts, things that define them are the water and the temperatures, right? If we think about wetlands and places like that, they're defined as a place where plants that are adapted to growing in water appear. That's the definition of a wetland. So temperature and water regime tend to be two of the most important things determining where things can survive. Okay? And climate, in its essence, is temperature and water. It's the average temperature regime which drives precipitation regimes, snowfall, rainfall, things like that, evaporation. So as climate changes, most places are going to get hotter. And as confusing as it seems, some places are going to get drier and other places are going to get wetter. And it's going to vary depending on where you are. And so climate change is changing the very things that drive the distribution and abundance of all life on Earth. So we expect that climate is going to have an effect on ecology. And the short story basically is this. If ecology is the distribution and abundance of life on Earth, and climate is temperature and moisture, as areas get hotter and drier or wetter, populations will either have to adapt to the new conditions, they'll have to leave to find better conditions, or they die out, and that's that. These are very simple sort of outcomes, and they're relatively predictable if we know the life history of these organisms well. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of temperature shifting and organisms following those temperature shifts. We call those range shifts. And basically what we're seeing a lot of times is the area where we find an animal or a plant is what we call its range. And as the temperatures are warming, we're seeing a northward shift in a lot of ranges. The populations essentially are just moving upward. And that leads to a few different things. So we see the shift towards these higher latitudes and higher elevations. We're seeing this reduction and loss of polar habitats, which is what's affecting the polar bears. Basically, there's no place northward for them to move anymore. We're seeing losses in wetlands. We're seeing losses in deserts, which is interesting, right? Some wetland areas that are used to being wet all the time are becoming drier, and some desert areas that are used to being dry all the time are becoming wetter. But either way, we're seeing these massive changes in these habitats, and the life that lives there has to adapt to those changes. So as their population range starts to move northward, what we see, and this is a very simple illustration. So this circle is the range of the species, Each one of these blue dots would be a local population. The local population of white-tailed deer in Lexington versus Annapolis. Okay. And as the temperature warms, that range, that circle, shifts northward. Now, the animals that can track that change will follow it up. Plants and things like that can't track those as easily, they'll basically go extinct in those areas where they used to exist. And if this range shifts far enough, we can see what we call local extinction in all the areas southward where these organisms, these life forms used to exist. On the other hand, we also see new populations emerge. So these animals or these plants will start to show up in places where they've never been seen historically. We're seeing both of these things play out right now. This was something, again, we predicted was going to happen based on our simple understanding of ecology, and it's happening faster than we ever thought it would. There's been a lot of extinctions, well, an alarming amount of extinctions of high altitude species. This is a mountain pika. It's an adorable little critter about yay big. It's actually related to a rabbit. And if you've ever, hiked in higher elevations of the West, you probably heard its loud squeak that it sends out every once in a while. This animal has more or less become extinct from a large area of the Sierra Nevada mountains where it historically always existed. And this is just simply due to rising temperatures and them running out of mountain to climb up. And a study by a man named Weems in 2016 actually demonstrated that when you look at all the records we have for local extinctions, like documented areas where certain species have gone extinct, 40% of all the species that they surveyed in that study had undergone some kind of local extinction. So if they just chose a whole bunch, they chose every species that they had good records for, and they looked for ones where you found records of local extinction due to range shift, and fully 40% of the species that they surveyed had. So that's nearly half the species that have disappeared from places where they're historically found. So I'm a fish guy, right? I like to catch fish, I like to eat fish, I still eat fish, that's my favorite, right? One of my favorite examples is on the Atlantic coast and the fish stocks that are changing their distribution, right? So this is going all the way back to 2009, and Jonathan Hare and William Overholser, two folks that I actually met in graduate school, they sort of oversaw this with Janet and I doing the real heavy lifting. And what they did was they had these data that they would take their ships, the National Marine Fisheries Service would take their ships, and they'd go out all along these areas, and they would drag fishing gear, just like the anglers would, to try to catch fish and see where they were. But they would do it in a random way. See, anglers know where to go to catch fish. They don't want to waste time in places where they're not going to catch fish. I don't want to waste time in places I'm not going to catch fish, right? And if your money and your livelihood depends on it, you're not going to waste time in areas where there's no fish. But that's not a great representation necessarily of where the fish are. That's just where the anglers know they are, right? So these scientists would go out and they would look for fish in random places and just see where they found different species. And so when these scientists went back and looked at their records, which extended all the way back into the 70s, they were able to see, well, are we seeing differences in where we find species along the coast, right? Now, not every fish had changed its distribution, but some fish had changed their distributions very strongly. So I put on the previous slide, this is the Atlantic hake or silver hake. You may have heard it called whiting before if you've ever done any fishing off the North Carolina coast or further north. You probably never ordered it at the southern end, but it's probably been in any fish sandwich or fish sticks or fake crab you've ever eaten, right? It's a staple. It's a $9 million fishery on the Atlantic coast of the United States. And it's bycatch. It's nothing anybody goes out particularly looking for. It's just something that they catch along the way and they can make a good living selling. So when we look at the distribution of hake going back to 1968, these are average distributions in 4-year intervals, right? So 68 to 72, 73 to 77, and so on and so on. So left to right across the top, and then left to right across the bottom. What you'll see if you look at the pattern here, red means there are more of those fish there. This is silver hake. Most of the fish are down here, right? So here's, where are we here? There's Massachusetts, there's Cape Cod, they're down here to the south, and moving out of the Northeast and into the Mid-Atlantic, basically. 4 years later, certainly definitely more of a southern species, but some presence up here. They weren't absent from those areas before, they're just less abundant. In this 40-year period, they really seem to be abundant in those areas. Bumper crop, maybe, right? And as we move on through time, what we see is fewer and fewer instances of them being found in these southern waters. And now, where they used to be rarer in the northern waters, that's where their distribution is concentrated, up here in the northern waters of Georgia's banks, places like that. So this is fish tracking temperature. Basically what's happening, the waters are rapidly changing temperature, and the fish are just tracking their preferred temperature northward. They're finding new places to live. Now, because silver hate doesn't really show up on our radar very often, I can imagine it's kind of hard to care about this, right? But the people that fish for these species and make a living off of that care about it very much. This was an article in the New York Times from a few years ago that highlighted how these changes in fish distributions on the Atlantic coast, and there are multiple species that have changed their distributions, have led to people having to completely either pick up and move someplace else to be able to continue fishing the way they always have, or completely change their fishing. Start targeting different species, which in many cases means changing your gear, changing your boat, massive capital investments to try to keep up with these changes in your local environment. It's affected not only individuals, but it's affected communities. If any of you have ever been along the Atlantic coast and visited places like Gloucester and Massachusetts, these towns that are built around a historic fishing community, it's the backbone, it's the lifeblood of these places. And these changes we're seeing impacts of these changes in those communities. It's affecting their ability basically to exist the way they historically existed. It's also going to hit the rest of us in one form or another, because if they have to just simply move further away from their home port to catch fish, that's going to increase the cost of operations, which means we're going to have to pay more for fish. And as we see these fish getting crowded in smaller and smaller places, smaller and smaller areas, just like the polar bear competing for a smaller and smaller slice of the pie, that means the fish population, the individual fish in it, can't put as much energy towards reproducing if they can barely get enough food to survive, right? And so what we see is lower productions in these fisheries, which translates to lower catches, and lower catches means more expensive fish, more expensive seafood. One thing that a lot of people don't appreciate is that seafood for us is a luxury, but these changes are happening all around the world. And in other areas, if you look at the population of the world, fish is the primary source of protein for over 20% of our population. That's not the case in the United States, but it's certainly the case in a lot of the Pacific Island nations, a lot more coastal artisanal fisheries and things like that rely really heavily on being able to catch fish to supply protein to their communities. So these areas are getting hit in ways that we can't really relate to. So that brings me to the question of, for lack of a better term, why do we care? Right? Why do we care about polar bears? I'm not going to see one unless I happen to, catch a plane to Churchill and get on one of those polar bear tours, which costs more than I can actually afford. So I'm not going to do that. The real reason we care is that individual species losses may not hit us very hard. But the way those species losses affect those ecosystems is what's going to hit us hard. So an ecosystem is a group of organisms, a group of life forms living in a certain area and interacting in some way. The most common way we think about that is who eats what, who gets eaten and who eats something else, right? And all those interactions affect everything from where we see certain things to how many of those things we see. That's what we call the structure of the ecosystem. It's the who is there and what is there. From the physical habitat, like the rocks, the plants, the soil, to the biota, like the trees, the plants that are inhabiting it, the animals that are walking around eating things and eating each other. Right? The function is what each one of those things does, individually and collectively. So when a tree root noses down into a rock crevice, to try to get its roots in deeper, it starts breaking that rock apart, and it contributes to something called soil creation, right? It starts to weather away that rock and break out little pieces of it that can then become smaller and smaller and get incorporated into soil. That soil building process is the reason we have soil to plant our crops on. And so every form of life in an ecosystem has a role in that ecosystem. If we're lucky, we have ecosystems with lots of forms of life, and so there's lots of different forms that can fill individual roles, And so if we lose one, the ecosystem continues to function the way it always has, because there's something else that just step in and fill that role. But sometimes there are organisms that fill very specific roles in an ecosystem. And if we lose that organism, the ecosystem can change very, very dramatically. Those species are often called keystone species. And if you follow the way the Rocky Mountains have responded to the reintroduction of gray wolves over there, it's changed the system dramatically. It's reduced overbrowsing by deer and elk species. It's allowed beavers to re-enter certain areas of habitats where they've been excluded for a long time. It's moving coyotes out of those habitats. It's having this profound change. It's all due to one species. And we eliminated that species many years ago, and we saw the other types of changes, the changes in the other direction, happen very rapidly. By reintroducing them, we're actually seeing that we can restore that function just by restoring the role of that one critter to that place. So why do we care about the structure and function of ecosystems? Apart from wanting to see places the way they're meant to be seen, Yellowstone with wolves and grizzly bears and things like that, we care about structure and function of ecosystems because ecosystems supply services to us that support our well-being. And this is where ecological changes will affect humanity, is in the changes in ecosystem services. So I put 3 sort of big categories of ecosystem services out here. Provisioning services include things like growing timber so that we can build houses and shelter, food, provisioning food. This includes agricultural systems as well as wild harvested food from the oceans and things like that. Providing fresh water. We're very lucky here that we're in an area of the watershed that hasn't been terribly impacted by development and has a good, healthy amount of forest. And that helps filter the water before it enters the Maury River, which is where we get our water, right? And so those natural functions, or if I live out in the county, I get my water out of the hole in the ground, right? I'm fortunate that everything above ground helps to filter that water on its way down into the aquifer or on its way into the river to provide me with clean, fresh water. And it's natural ecosystems that provide those services. Regulating services are ones that we're hearing a lot more about because one of the big ones is flood regulation. Ever since Katrina, we have a newfound appreciation for how those coastal wetlands and barrier islands can absorb a lot of the energy from these storms before they have a chance to flood inland areas. Climate regulation, I think Lisa probably covered that last week, so I'm not going to get into that one. But climate regulation is obviously something that happens a lot with natural ecosystems. Every piece of wood in this room started as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The plants sucked it in, turned it into a hard cell structure, and it's been stuck in that form ever since. So those are processes that help regulate our climate by taking carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it away for a long time in this sort of solid, difficult to digest form. Cultural services are the ones that we often relate to the most strongly, but we reject the most easily, which is sad, right? So cultural services include recreation. Like we accept the loss of habitat for recreation a lot faster than we would, we probably should accept it, than we are aware of the loss of other types of services. Aesthetic beauty is a cultural service that ecosystems offer. Education, I benefit a lot from living in a natural area like this with lots of nice streams that I can take students out into to show them how they work and not have to show them pictures on a slideshow so that they know what a stream looks like. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the LA River, where my in-laws live. The LA River is a drainage ditch. It was once a free-flowing river. But the good people of the management agencies there decided it was just easier to manage if they turned the whole thing into concrete. And if you live near there, you might not know what a real river looks like unless somebody was nice enough to take you outside the bounds of the city and show you what it looked like. Here, I don't have to do that. I can take them out my back door. The challenge is, as we lose these services, we probably can't replace them with technology. And that's going to be the biggest challenge to humanity, is that we won't understand what we're losing until it's gone. Because a lot of times, we don't understand how ecosystems work perfectly. And so we don't understand things until they change dramatically. And we started trying to figure out why. Well, once they change dramatically, those effects are going to start to be felt by us. And at that point, we're going to be scrambling to try to figure out either how to restore that ecosystem or how to somehow recoup the services that the ecosystem gave to us. It's hard to imagine how we would do that. It's hard to imagine how we would replace timber, for example, or wild foods resources and things like that. One thing that is certain is that the more money you have, the more buffered you are from these changes. And that raises the problem that the poorest nations are going to feel these pinches earlier and more severely. So let's take a look at some of the changes to humans, to ecosystems, and how those might affect human well-being. Not really sure which one there. Okay, so a study actually by a guy at Bowdoin College, where I went to college, in, I want to say it was 2016, they looked at all the ecosystem services that have been documented and studied in the United States to look at the ways that they support human well-being. And this includes timber production, farm crop production, wild food production, freshwater services, etc. And they looked at which ones were most likely to change dramatically with climate change, and then how that was going to affect humanity. And so the biggest ones that they identified were wildfire regulation. That's a service that's provided by intact systems which are naturally sort of going through death and growth processes in the forest. And natural wildfire processes historically have kept those wildfires from becoming big outbreaks. But as we're seeing recently, that's becoming harder and harder to control because we've interrupted those natural processes. Mm-hmm. Marine fishery production, we already talked about. Basically, that's going to hit us through the supply of seafood. Water supply is a big one. We're already feeling the pinch of that in the American West, where water supplies are really starting to dwindle and competition for remaining water is getting high. Coastal protection services, as I mentioned, we've been hearing about that since 2008 when Katrina came through, and we all learned about the value of those wetlands that can soak up water before it has a chance to get in. And then finally, nature-dependent tourism and outdoor recreation. These are the areas, the services that humanity relies on for natural sources, from natural ecosystems, that are going to most likely take the biggest hits in the future with climate change. So I want to finish with one really fascinating example. It's also a little frightening, so I hate to end on a scary note, but it's a really fascinating one. How many of you have heard of mountain pine beetles before? Okay, so you've likely also seen the damage that they can do. For those of you who aren't familiar with mountain pine beetles, they're a tiny little beetle that grows in large numbers during outbreaks. And during outbreaks, they can have they can exert really high mortality on tree populations that they attack. And they attack, the mountain pine beetle in particular, attacks a lot of different types of trees. There are lots of beetles like this that are called bark beetles generally. Probably 5 or 6 or maybe 8 different species in the United States, I think. Most of them have a very specific tree host. The mountain pine beetle is unusual in that it likes all kinds of trees. And the way the mountain pine beetle's life cycle works, so we're going to start up here in the first position, the adults. The adults will mate, which is basically the point of life for an insect, is to live long enough to mate and lay eggs, right? They live long enough to mate, infest a tree, like basically they bore a hole into a tree and they deposit their eggs there. And then they will die by the next cold spell, right? These are cold-blooded organisms. They're dependent on the temperature around them for their bodily functions, basically, right? Everything works better when it's warmer. Everything slows down when it's cold, just like me, okay? And as this gets too cold for the adults, they're just going to die out. But before they do, they're going to lay their eggs. And their eggs are going to hatch into this larval stage. And the larval stage tunnels into the soft wood underneath the bark of the tree. This is called the phloem of the tree, and it's where basically sugars from the leaves are sent down to the roots, right, and to other parts of the tree. It's what helps keeps the roots alive. So the roots get water and nutrients and send it up, and the leaves collect carbon dioxide, turn it into sugar, and send it down. These tunnels that they bore through here interrupt that flow. So the roots get less support from the top of the tree. In addition to that, it allows things like mold and fungus and things like that to infest the tree as well and start to grow in there. So as these guys are chomping away and growing, they're also essentially slowly killing this tree. Now, they'll stay in the tree through the winter, and then the next spring and summer, they'll turn into this form here, which is called a pupa. And the pupa, right before it's a little like a chrysalis form for a butterfly, right? It basically is a dormant phase where it's not moving around, it's not eating, it's metamorphosing into its adult form. But right before it goes into this form, it moves back into the bark and out of that soft wood underneath it. And the reason for that is, when it emerges as an adult, the adult is essentially going to eat its way through the bark. And it leaves these little bullet holes behind. This is one more way for mold, fungus, and other types of pathogens to get into the tree and kill the tree. So, at this stage now, the adults will immediately look for mates. And as soon as they have fertilized eggs, they will plant those eggs. If there is time before the next cold snap, they'll mate again, and they'll plant more eggs. And if there's time again, they'll mate again. This is their whole raising detriment. That's what they do. Okay? Can't blame them. They got one shot at it, right? Well, here's what happens with temperature. With temperature, essentially, I mentioned that the temperature determines the pace of biological reactions. These guys are just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. If it's warm, they'll grow faster. If it's cold, they'll grow slower, right? So, if they grow faster, there's things that trees can do to sort of defeat these things. You know, these are mostly pine and coniferous trees. They can produce that resin, you know. They can gum these things up in their holes and keep them from being able to crawl around and eat at it. They can produce organic chemicals that repel them in some cases, but they can also just wait for other bug predators to come in, like woodpeckers and little birds and things like that, to come in and try to pull those larvae out and hopefully stop the infestation, right? But who gets to eat you is largely determined in the animal world by how big you are. If you're smaller, anything can eat you. If you're bigger, only things that are bigger than you can eat you, right? So the faster you grow big as a bug larva, the fewer things get to eat you. Which means that as this process goes faster with warmer temperatures, more larvae manage to survive, turn into adults, and leave the tree. Now, on top of that, with later and later winters, we have adults able to actually breed more than once over the course of their adult life cycle, and therefore plant more eggs in the trees. So we end up with more larvae surviving, which means more adults emerging, and those more adults get to breed more often. This leads to what we call pest outbreaks, right? This is the classic sort of outbreak cycle. What we project will happen with climate change is that the outbreaks will not only become more severe in terms of the number of beetles that emerge and their effects on the trees, but they'll also become more rapid. Because basically there'll be more and more reproductive events happening every year that will allow for more and more of these larvae to survive and emerge more quickly. So we end up with more beetles attacking more trees. Now, at the same time, climate is changing and affecting the trees. So the climate change affects the beetles, but it also affects the trees. And these trees, in some areas, will be stressed by drought. They're certainly going to be stressed by the increased heat. It's going to be warmer than they're used to, warmer than the temperatures they evolved with on average. And so they're stressed out, right? And stressed out trees can't put as much towards defending themselves against beetles. They have to put more towards surviving, just maintaining their normal functions. Which means that they're more vulnerable, basically. These struggling trees become more vulnerable to beetle outbreaks and beetle infestations. This is an example of two pictures side by side, taken from the same area. It's a little bit washed out here, but you can see certainly this tree here is now dead. And if you look on down the valley, all these green trees are now brown down here. Kind of picture that really brings this home to us. This is one of my former students. His name's Oliver Natera. Graduated a few years back. We had a lot of fun doing research together. He's a fish head just like me, as you can tell, right? His senior year in high school, he hatched this plan. He and his buddies were going to throw on backpacks and go into the Wind River Mountains, cross the Continental Divide, and go fish these lakes way back there and catch these basically cutthroat trout that rarely ever see humans. Well, his friends chickened out, but his dad was like, I'm in. So he and his family arranged the trip. And this is a picture of him with one of the first trout he caught against one of his favorite backdrops there. It's looking up this valley. Well, 4 years later, when he was a senior in college, he finally convinced his buddies to make the trip with him. So he went back 4 years later with his friends. Now, I want you not to look at the kid, but look at the trees. And they went back to this exact same spot, and they took an identical picture from the same spot. And you can see the loss of live trees going all back there. And that is entirely due to mountain pine beetle outbreaks. It's pretty dramatic, and it's happening on very, very large scales. But there's an unfortunately even worse side to the story. This is the scary part, I apologize. Dead trees aren't scary. Forest fires are scary, right? So when you get more dead trees, and you get hotter and drier conditions as a result of climate change, you end up with more frequent forest fires, you end up with larger forest fires, and you end up with more intense forest fires. So one of the things that influences the intensity of a forest fire is whether or not it's mainly on the ground or if it makes its way up into the crown of the trees, right? You may have heard of crown fire before in forest fire speak. Well, these dry, dying needles up on these trees make it very easy to start a crown fire in a forest fire, like in a forest like this. And so, because of that, it's been predicted that we're not only going to see more intensive beetle outbreaks, but as a result of that, we're also going to see conditions in our forests which lead to more frequent forest fires, larger forest fires, and more intense forest fires. Now, you all know that that's been playing out for the last 2 years in a row, and it's been an absolute tragedy for the people that have to live with it in the American West right now. It's heartbreaking to see the loss that this has incurred, right? Can I tell you that it's due to bark beetles? No, I can't. Nobody can. There are multiple things that come together to start a forest fire. There are multiple things that come together to make a forest fire bigger. There are multiple things that come together to make a forest fire grow out of control. It's hard to put your finger on one thing and say that was the problem right there. But last year, the USDA and the US Forest Service got together and they looked at grabbed every best scientist they could, and they spent about 3 weeks studying the problem, looking at every paper that's ever been published. And they tried to figure out, can we say that bark beetles, and mountain pine beetles in particular, are causing increased intensity of forest fires in the United States? They said, we can't be sure, but our best information suggests yes. And that's about as good as we're going to get, because these are such complex processes, right? So, well, we don't have to go too far to think about the human impacts of forest fires. There's economic losses that we can talk about for sure. Lost timber revenues. These are potentially, valuable forests that, number one, the pine beetles are killing, and then number two, the forest fires are wiping out. So that's massive amounts of revenue that was money in the bank for somebody that is gone now. And those are provisioning services that we're going to feel the pinch for, right? Everybody's probably heard about lumber prices right now, right? That's a blip on the radar. That's a little bit different. That's a demand and supply issue right now. But increased forest fires are going to reduce supply of timber. And that's going to, in the long term, drive timber prices up. But then there's just the damages to the houses and the communities that individuals have to serve. And how about just the cost that it's going to take to get insurance for your home? When I was in graduate school, I lived a block from the beach. And I was on the first floor, and I tried to get renter's insurance to cover flood insurance, and they laughed at me. Absolutely just said, you're crazy. Why would we even do that? Well, it's getting harder and harder to get fire insurance in these places because they're just saying, well, why would you want to live there? It's also going to affect those climate regulation services that we talked about. So all this wood that's sequestering carbon and keeping it from going up into the atmosphere gets released when you burn the wood. And so you get with these big forest fires, you get these massive releases of carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere, and that is a greenhouse gas. And at the same time, even if we don't have those forest fires, we've got these dead trees down on the forest floor. They're decomposing, and they're also releasing CO2 through bacterial decomposition. And so these forests that we were relying on to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it away for us are now becoming sources of atmospheric carbon instead of sinks for them. And that's accelerating climate change, which means it's going to be hotter and drier, which means there's going to be more bark beetle outbreaks, which means there's going to be more dead trees, more forest fires. That's what we call a positive feedback loop. And positive feedback loops are scary because they tend to just accelerate processes. It's those positive feedback loops, I'm guessing Lisa talked a little bit about, that are creating some of the surprises that scientists are seeing now with accelerating changes. So, the take-home message is that I started with the theory, right? Ecology is distribution and abundance. Distribution and abundance is mainly determined by temperature and moisture. And, in that case then, we would expect temperature and moisture to change with climate, and that would change the distribution and abundance of organisms. That was what was predicted, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it play out actually quite rapidly. We're seeing it play out in ways that we didn't actually expect in some cases. Now, how much change we see in the world is going to be determined by how much change we get in the climate. That's the ecological changes are going to be driven by the climate changes. Climate change is currently altering the distribution and abundance of life on Earth. When I first gave this talk 13 years ago, that said, will alter. That's how much has changed just in the last 13 years. These changes, as you lose species from certain areas, gain new species in others, it's going to change those ecosystems. And those ecosystems, as they change, are going to change the services that they give to us, and that's going to affect human well-being and human communities. Now, I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. There's actually new opportunities that are going to emerge here, okay? We're going to be able to grow crops in places that we weren't able to grow them before. We're going to be able to grow valuable crops in places where they weren't able to grow before without having to put as much intensive input into them in some cases. So there are opportunities here to capitalize on some of these changes and turn some of them into positives, right? But again, the biggest impacts are going to be felt by those communities of the lowest socioeconomic means. And so what really emerges here is not an alarm bell about what changes are to come. There's not a whole lot we can do to change that, right? Some of these changes are happening, and how bad they are is what we have an influence on. But how bad they affect people is something that we can actually control or at least influence. Those communities of the lowest socioeconomic means are going to have the least ability to adapt. If we address issues like social justice and environmental justice first, we can actually seek to try to reduce the overall impacts that climate change and ecological changes will have on humanity as a whole, as opposed to just hunker down and try to hope that we weather the storm. So that's my take-home message. It's a little depressing, I apologize. But this whole class that I teach, environmental studies, gets depressing sometimes. So I like to just put up a fish picture to talk about it, but that's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much.
Not more. I came in not a very high level.
Okay.
In any event, could you talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe and especially Siberia? Is it pretty much mirroring all the things that you said?
So
one of
some of the changes we're seeing in areas like Siberia, which are these far north areas, are big changes in vegetation communities. Right? So we're seeing tundra vegetation being replaced by low-lying shrubs and things like that, which then in turn is allowing new animals and other plants to establish in those areas. Because basically, tundra is too cold a soil for most things to grow, right? But as it warms up and thaws, we're starting to see new vegetation colonize it, and that's changing the habitats of the species that live there. You can imagine if you lived in a place that you're a visual predator, like a bear or something like that, and you live in a place where all the vegetation is low-lying tundra, you can see prey for miles, right? But when you start to grow up that vegetation, all of a sudden you're hunting in an environment that never evolved, and so that's having impacts on the other organisms that live there on top of that. It's complex though. These systems are these interacting critters with nonlinear interactions, for lack of a better term, right? You can't predict what's going to happen when you push one button and expect something else. Sometimes things change in ways we don't expect. That's my best understanding of what's happening in those high latitude areas of that continent. They are sort of mirroring what we're seeing here, but I haven't paid as much attention to the research coming out of that comment as I have this one.
The fires are bad there.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I do know is that mountain pine beetle outbreaks, or bark beetle outbreaks, in Europe and in Eurasia haven't been as bad as they predicted they would be in some places. And on the flip side, they've been worse than they predicted they would be in others. But by and large, Europe has not been hit as bad by the bark beetle outbreaks as we have here. And so that's one of the things I do notice is different.
Another question? Back here?
Is there no way at all of controlling the bark beetle?
So, controlling insect infestations in forests is really, really challenging. There's some good examples we have around here that you may be familiar with. So there's the emerald ash borer, which is an introduced species in our area that is slowly but surely killing all the ash trees, the white ashes on the East Coast. There's the hemlock woolly adelgid, which has almost wiped out the eastern hemlock from most of Virginia. There's a few stands that are remaining, but they're infested and they will die. And then there's, of course, the gypsy moth, right? Those are examples of massive insect infestations in these large areas of forest. It's so hard to control those because of the scale of them and how quickly they can move. And we have a few options, right? There's chemical control. And applying that over a large area effectively comes with a lot of dangers, right? A lot of collateral damage sometimes. There's no single pesticide that we can guarantee is only going to kill those things, right? So we have to accept losses of lots of other things. There's targeted control. So I can inject something into the remaining ash trees at my place to try to keep the emerald ash borer from killing them. I have to inject that into every tree, every year, twice a year. You can't do that at the scale of the forest. I can do it on my property, but I can't do it on the scale of the forest. And then there's biological control. We could release a predator that would try to control those organisms. We've had some luck with that. We've released wasps in California that saved the citrus crops there. And these wasps are very, very specific. They plant their eggs in one very specific insect host. So it's the perfect situation. We have an insect pest that's affecting citrus crops, and we have a wasp that will kill that pest and nothing else. Wasps are parasites, basically, or parasitoids, right? They're horrible creatures. they literally plant their eggs in another living creature, and then that living creature has to carry those eggs, and then when the larvae hatch, they eat that critter from the inside out. It's awful, right? Every wasp does this. It's crazy.
Everybody ready for dinner?
But that's an example of where we have something that can control a particular pest and we can get high success with it. If that pest doesn't have a very specific predator, we risk losing other species as collateral damage. And times we've tried it, where we have a pest like, there's a weevil, I remember, it's not the boll weevil, but it was another weevil, I think it was a thistle weevil or something like that. We tried to release to kill off Russian thistle after it invaded. It had horrible effects on our native species, right? And it was supposed to be very specific, but it still had these negative impacts. And there's been predators that we released to try to eat some of our insect pests. And they start out eating insect pests, and then they start eating everything else, and they ignore the original pest that we had in the first place. So it's a huge risk. So there are things that we could do to control the bark beetles in the United States. The options we have are few, some of them are highly risky, and the most consistent, like the most reliable ones, just can't be applied at scale. So that's the challenge.
Another question? I got one.
This is getting more depressing by the minute. I'm
All
sorry.
right, I'm going to make it less depressing. I read a figure today that said 2% of the coastal area is covered with mangroves and other kinds of wild-growing plants, and yet it's the source of 50% of the absorption of carbon. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Well, there's a couple of different ways in which mangroves are responsible for such control on atmospheric carbon. So it's not just CO2 is the secret, right? They do absorb a lot of carbon, but they also sequester a lot under their leaves and things like that. If you've ever been to a mangrove swamp or a mangrove area, it's this mucky, substrate. It's not sand. It's not pleasant to walk in. You put your foot in it. You pull your foot out. It smells disgusting. It's basically a place where there's very little oxygen. Mangroves actually are well adapted to living in these places, and they have these little shoots that they can run up off their roots that are like snorkels. It allows them to actually get oxygen from the air and sink down to their roots. It's fascinating stuff, right? They're little root storms. But as they drop their leaves and things like that, those leaves and sticks and seeds and everything that they drop can get buried in that muck. And because that muck has no oxygen in it, it doesn't get decomposed very much. But the things that do decompose it are adapted to low oxygen conditions. And as a result, when we decompose something in our bodies, we use oxygen, right? And so we breathe out CO2. And most organisms that use oxygen as part of that decomposition process will likewise breathe out CO2. But if you live in a place where there's no oxygen, you have to have other biochemical pathways to break down things like plant material and stuff like that. And those biochemical pathways produce other waste products. One of the big ones is methane. So those mucky swamps, when you pull your foot out, one of the things you're smelling is a combination of sulfur dioxide, one of the compounds that comes out of that digestion process, and then there's a lot of methane that comes out as well. So where you have intact mangrove areas, you have a lot of carbon sequestration in the soils, and a lot of that carbon is in the form of methane, which methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So areas where they take out those mangrove swamps, you get a massive release of methane in the process. And so that's why mangrove swamps are attributed with sequestering and taking out so much greenhouse gas. It's not necessarily just carbon dioxide. It's the methane that is released when we take them out.
We have time for one more question, Martin.
You started with polar bears. What do polar bears eat? And as the Arctic is getting warmer, is their food source in danger?
So they primarily eat seals. And their food source probably isn't in much danger. Right? In fact, seal populations and sea lion populations seem to be on the rebound in a lot of places, as far as I know. They're not as dependent on that sea ice. Now, they are dependent on it for their haul-out period. Marine mammals do everything in the water except give birth, right? So when they do give birth, they have to have a place they can haul out, crawl onto either ice or dry land. They prefer ice, and give birth to their pups. And then their pups have to stay there long enough that they can fend for themselves and follow the mother when they later on come off the ice. So at this point, we haven't seen an impact, to my knowledge, of seal populations from reduced ice pack, right? But what we are seeing is that there's less area to hunt. And so there's more concentration of hunting pressure in those areas, so there's higher seal mortality in those areas as well, right? So it's spotty. Right? It's not all seal populations are in decline, but some certainly in certain areas are feeling the pinch of increased predation. They shouldn't be affected by climate change the same way. And that's one of the interesting things is that when you have two organisms, two species that have a close relationship, when one is affected by climate and the other one isn't, you get this mismatch, this imbalance in their relationship that can throw off things.
Sandra, you want to add a final question?
You mentioned in the beginning that we're not going to engineer our way out of this. Do you see anything that would be viable that would help?
Well, so I should qualify that. We're not going to engineer our way out of the loss of ecosystem services. Because ecosystem services like flood control and things like that, just operate at too big a scale for us to replicate. There's this great story about how the city of New York used to have this amazing drinking water quality, right? And then it declined as the Hudson River Valley upstream got basically populated, and they converted wetlands into areas for building houses and things like that. And I don't know if this story is actually true, but it's told over and over again, so I'm just going to contribute to that, repeating of multiple stories. And then when their water quality started declining, they looked into what they could do to improve drinking water quality in the city. And it came down to, you can spend, let's say, these numbers are wrong, but just for it's about the right comparison. You could spend $1 billion restoring the wetlands upstream that naturally filtered the water for you, or you could spend $5 billion creating a massive water treatment plant to try to restore that water quality. And so the idea is that trying to replicate the same service on the same scale is much more expensive than just getting it for free, right? So we're not going to engineer our way out of the loss of ecosystem services. But I am more and more excited, encouraged by what I see in terms of carbon capture technology and the ability to replace fossil fuel dependent industries and processes with renewables. I'm especially excited about the advent of some of the carbon capture because for a long time now, we've known that if we can get good carbon capture technology on board sooner, we can buy ourselves some time to shift from fossil fuels over to renewables. If we don't get that, we have to make that shift much faster, and that's a daunting task.
Well, thank you again, Robert. This has been great. Really great.